Now, I want to talk about a person who is one of the great media stars. He has magic. I talked about magic last week. He has a lot of magic, and the proof of it are the number of people who show up just to imbibe his presence and to look at him and experience him, even if they may not agree with all his opinions. So he is a very successful media star, and he is not 36 years old. He's a media star, gives hope to all of us. No. He's a media star at the age of 77. He is the ruler and leader of the Roman Catholic Church. His name used to be Karol Wojtyła, but now he is called with his church name, his monarchical name, John Paul II. And it's a very important figure because the most successful organized religion in the world, I'm not talking about religion in the broad sense. Religion in the broad sense is divided up into Christianity, Islam, Judaism. I'm talking about organized religion. Organized religion is attached to an organization. The most successful religious organization in the world that may have over 800 million members, almost 1/6 of the human race, is the Roman Catholic Church, of which he is the head. And therefore what he thinks, what he says, what he does is of great importance. And in fact, rulers of nations all over the world defer to him. In fact, he is planning an extraordinary trip, a trip that nobody ever thought he would make. He's making a trip to Cuba. He's going to go to Cuba. They're getting ready for him. Fidel Castro got a new uniform. No, he's... I mean, who would believe? I mean, he will go anywhere. I mean, everybody defers to him. And Castro, who hates organized religion and has said it over and over and over again, is trying to make him comfortable arriving in Cuba. So he obviously has great power. And that power is also reflected in the United States of America, because the largest organized religious denomination in the United States of America remains the Roman Catholic Church, and if you're talking about urban America, overwhelmingly important. So what I want to do is to talk about John Paul II, not only in terms of was he nice to his mother, or how is he in private. I want to talk about him in terms of his job, because his job is very, very important. It's a job that is one of the most powerful jobs in the world. I talked about the British monarchy last week, and now I'm talking about the papacy. It's a role. It's been filled by very, very powerful and significant people over the past 1800 or 1900 years. And the question is, where is it going? And where is the church going? Now, the roots of the papacy lie, of course, in the emergence of the most successful religion in the history of the world. It is called Christianity, and it may have in the world today somewhere close to 1.5 billion people who are in some way attached to it. No other organized religion in the world, or disorganized religion in the world, can make that statement. To understand the Pope, you have to understand the roots of Christianity. Part of the root of Christianity lies in the history and practices and ideas of the Jewish people. Because after all, one of the most important documents of the Roman Catholic Church, if not the most important, is the Bible. And certainly if you're talking about the Old Testament and the figures of the New Testament, you're talking about the Jews and Judaism. One of the important roots, and there's no doubt about it, of the Pope and of Christianity lies in a culture which took over most of the Western world. We call it Hellenism. A culture that was brought by the Greeks, the first language of Christianity. Its basic language out of which its fundamental documents were made was Greek. And in fact, you can't understand the Pope and the arguments that surrounded the Pope without understanding the arguments of Greek philosophy. One of the most powerful roots of Christianity, and it certainly applies to the job of the Pope, is the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire was this great empire that featured a very powerful ruler who lived in Rome. He was called the Emperor. And the Emperor symbolized the unity and power of Rome, which aspired to be a universal empire that would include the whole world. Now, as we will discover or see, there are many, many similarities between the Roman emperor and his power and the role of the Pope. One of the roots obviously lies in a tension between the two great parts of the Hellenistic world. The Roman people pretty much gave up their own culture and adopted Greek culture. So we call it Greco-Roman culture. And the Roman world was divided into two languages, and basically two peoples. One, the Greeks, the other, the Latins or the Romans, and the tension between them, which never went away in the Greco-Roman world, was reflected in an attachment to the language. Obviously, the people in the eastern part of the empire were attached to Greek, and the people in the western part of the empire were attached to Latin. But one of the roots of Christianity and its success and power rests in the fact that Christianity found its home basically in Europe. It is a European religion. People identify Christianity even when it spreads out. Its homeland, its center, is not viewed as Israel or Palestine. Its center is Europe. And the reason why Christianity is so powerful and the Pope is so powerful is that Europe is so powerful. What if Europe had had the same history as Africa? Would Christianity have been, and Christianity was in Africa, would Christianity have been as powerful? You cannot separate the story and success of Christianity from the story and success of the European nations and the European people. Now, the Pope is attached to a success story. And that success story is the success of Christianity, and I want to point out the reasons for that success, because one of the great disputes with regard to the future of the Pope and the Roman Catholic Church has to do with an evaluation of what makes the church successful. So it's very important to remember what made the church successful. The first and most important thing was a message. A message promising something called salvation. And salvation was eternal life. Eternal life that would be splendidly marvelous or marvelously splendid, whatever you want, there it was. It was a promise that today no institution here on earth outside organized religion can make. And if you believe that indeed the promise can be kept, the power of the promise makers is overwhelming. Its success lay in the fact that from the very beginning, Christianity, unlike other religions, opened itself to everybody. In fact, its first adherents were primarily women and slaves, long before the aristocracy took it over. One of its reasons for success was its elaborate, magnificent, and powerful ritual, which was viewed by people as the gate to heaven. Participate in the ritual. Enter into the splendid buildings of this church, and you are on your way. Do you understand? You are on your way to salvation. The ritual was part of the key to salvation. One of the reasons for its success, and it's the big test of the church today. It's why Sachs and Neiman always have a problem. If you can't find it in Sachs, you may find it in Neiman's. And if you don't find it in Neiman's, you may find it in Nordstrom's. And if you don't find it in Nordstrom's, maybe you'll find it in Hudson's. I don't know. Okay. What makes an organization powerful is that people believe that it's the only place where the reward can be achieved. And Christianity from the very beginning said that it was the exclusive possessor of the truth and of the way to salvation. You cannot find salvation through any other church. The keys to the kingdom. Nobody else has the key. And obviously, one of its successes lay in the example of the people who lived the Christian life. They were willing to die for it. And in fact, if you are raised within the framework of traditional Christianity, the stories of the martyrs are there to inspire you. In fact, they are testimony to the power and truth of the religion. These people are willing to what? To die. But I do want to say that one of the most important reasons for the success of Christianity was the quality of its clergy. I do not think any other religion in the history of religions has produced a clergy as diverse, as talented, and as ambitious. Not the Hindu world, certainly not the Confucian world, not the Buddhist world, not the Muslim world, not the Jewish world, all right? And in fact, the Pope is a member of the clergy. You have to understand how that clergy works and operates. And in fact, one of the major reasons was the presence of this priestly class. Now, from the very beginning, Christianity suffered from certain problems that never go away from the church. And I want to mention them. I mean, the Roman Catholic Church still deals with them. The Protestant Church deals with them. One is that the Christian religion purports to create a world society of believing Christians. But the world is divided up into nations. It's divided up into Russians, Serbians, English, French, Germans, Chinese, Japanese, whatever. And they have long histories of their own ancestral religions and long histories of hating each other. So how you put together a universal church when you have such diverse nations, and the basic problem is that if you want to take over a nation, you have to identify with its patriotism. If you identify with its patriotism, you then identify with its hatreds as well as its loves. I mean, in World War II, if I am a Polish Catholic and I'm at war with Germany, Do I want my God to defeat the Germans? And if I am a German Catholic and I identify my God with German patriotism, do I not want my God to defeat the Poles? In every war, two sides are what? They're praying to their God for the destruction of the other. So part of the problem with the universal religion as opposed to a national religion, you see the problem. Part of the problem is how you transcend these national and ethnic divisions. One of the problems that occurred very early in the history of the church was the invasion of the Roman Empire by people who were called by the Greeks and the Romans barbarians. They were mainly people from northern Europe. We call them Teutons, and they conquered most of the Roman Empire. And the big issue which arose then was, what do we do with these people? When they conquered the Roman Empire, they were not Christians. How do you adapt them? Or how do you adapt to them? One of the major problems was that the Christian church was deeply influenced by Hellenism. Hellenism was deeply influenced by philosophy. And philosophy therefore produced a ritual in the Christian church, which doesn't exist in most other religions. It's the recitation of creeds. Now, you cannot control what people believe. People believe what they believe. You can control their mouth. You can control what they say. Many people will say things to other people that they don't really believe, but they say them because they're afraid to tell people what they really think. But we all have that in families, friendships, business, whatever. I mean, it's called discretion for survival. Now, that doesn't mean that in the middle of the 21st century we won't be able to control belief. We'll just put those electrodes. No, zap! But we haven't reached that stage. No. We haven't reached that stage yet, all right? So the only way you can deal with belief is through what you say. It's not true that the church required conformity of belief. I mean, how would you find out what a person believes? What the church required was conformity to creed. Publicly, you had to stand up and say certain things. And now the issue was, what should go into what you say? Well, that became a big issue. In fact, the emphasis on creeds created a situation where if you disagreed philosophically, you came up with a different creed. And since you believed that the recitation of the creed was tied to the path for salvation, you would use all the powers of the government to enforce your creed. So that created turmoil in the Christian world, I can't tell you. To find a simple statement that everybody would say without controversy was not easy. It's like, you ever been on a committee and you try to get a committee statement, please? Finally you say, Gertrude, you do it. No, I mean, Helen, you do it. We can't, this is the end, we can't get the statement out. All right, fine. One of the problems, obviously, was women. In the Semitic or Jewish world, women's role was primarily that of bearing children and raising them. In the Greco-Roman world, the status of women was higher. And that was evidenced by the fact that monogamy was required. And it was true that the first converts to Christianity were primarily women. So one of the issues was, what do we do with women? After all, the top job in the church was that of priest. Many other religions allow women clergy, or there were priestesses throughout the ancient world. Do you allow women to be the clergy? And the answer that came out of the church very early was maybe. They cannot be priests, but we have another role. That is called the saintly life. The saintly life are people who prepare for heaven by, in a sense, denying this world. For men, they become monks or friars, brothers, and for women, they become nuns or sisters, and they are kind of lower order of clergy. But the higher order of clergy, those who administer the sacraments, those who conduct the basic rituals which are the keys to the kingdom, the answer was no. And for a long, long time, that was acceptable. One of the issues, obviously, was if you want a universal church, and it's the big issue in America, do you have a strong central government or do you have a weak central government? And that argument went on for a long, long time. In the end, there developed strong regional centralization. In fact, there appeared 4 popes. There was a Latin pope in Rome. There was a Greek pope in Constantinople. There was a Syrian pope in what used to be a city called Antioch, which is now in Ohio. No, I mean, it's a college. It used to be in Syria. And the 4th and very powerful one was an Egyptian one, he was the pope in Alexandria. And now a rivalry arose because the question was, should this church be centralized? If indeed there is one path to salvation, then we have to agree on the one path to salvation. And the last, of course, was the tension. The tension was that 3 of the popes lived under the control of a Roman emperor who lived in Constantinople and who also fancied himself as the head of the church. Only one pope lost the emperor, and that pope was the pope in Rome, because in 476 the barbarians took Italy, and in fact they deposed the Roman emperor in Rome. But the Roman emperor in Constantinople remained, and he controlled Constantinople, Antioch, and Alexandria. Now, our focus is not on Egypt or Syria or the Greeks. Our focus is on Western Europe and the people that we call the Latins, or the people involved with the Latin church. The Latins faced, with the collapse of the Roman Empire, a major change, the Latin church. First of all, they had all these people who were not Christians who conquered them. They are the ancestors of the Germanic people, and the Germanic people came in waves. The first waves were Goths, and the second waves were Bavarians and Lombards and Franks, and the third wave were called Vikings. One of the problems was that the infrastructure which supported the economy of Western Europe collapsed with the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West. One of the challenges was that when the Roman emperor disappeared in Rome, the Roman emperor in Constantinople said to the bishop of Rome, "Well, I'm in charge now." Oh. And, of course, the great challenge was that a new religion arose called Islam, which swept over all of Western Asia, conquered Syria and Egypt, eliminated those two popes, and took all of North Africa, invaded Spain, and was on its way to invading Western Europe, took over the Mediterranean, and the great fear was that the Muslims would conquer Europe. Now, the way the Western or Latin Church coped with those challenges was to produce the job that I spoke about. Their greatest success story was they converted the Germans. What if the Germans had kept their own religion? What if they had kept their Teutonic religion? Well, we still have a little bit of it. We have Woden's Day and Tiwa's Day and Thor's Day, right, and Frigga's Day. All right, so we still have a little bit of the German religion, but they converted them to, in order to keep the Muslims out and the Vikings out and whatever else, they developed a system built around warriors. That system built around warriors for the recruiting of soldiers for the defense of Western Europe is called feudalism. And in fact, that warrior order made an alliance with the church. The church and the warriors and the church together. The third was that in times of trouble, people become more religious. And therefore, as times got worse in the 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th century, the church itself became more important. It was the place of refuge. This world was terrible. People dreamed of the next world. One of the ways, therefore, that the church coped was that it now had this fantastic clergy. The people were more religious. The people were more dependent on the church, and the clergy now became, for all practical purposes, the leaders of the people. They had to share some of that leadership with the feudal lords, but the feudal lords were never viewed as having the keys to the kingdom of heaven. One of the ways they coped, because the Greek emperor was very persistent, was that Western Europe, the Western Church, seceded, by the way. If you read Roman Catholic doctrine, they always say that the patriarch in Constantinople, the Orthodox Church, seceded from the Roman Catholic. Depends on how you look at it. The people in Constantinople saw the church, the Western Church, seceding from Constantinople, because Constantinople, the Roman emperor in Constantinople, was certainly the more powerful leader because his section was richer and more powerful. In the end, the West seceded, and now comes the most important thing. There now emerged in Western Europe a substitute for the Roman emperor. He lived in Rome. He had a palace in Rome. In many ways, his clothing and garments were similar to those worn by the emperor. His authority was the authority of the emperor. And in fact, it was very important that he stay in Rome, because the leader of the Western Church was not simply the direct descendant of Jesus in terms of authority. He was also the direct descendant of the figure of the job that symbolized to the people of Western Europe political authority. And so when you go to Rome and you visit the Vatican is a continuation of all the palaces of all the rulers that have existed in Rome. And if you don't understand that, it's very hard to understand the power and prestige of this office. The power and prestige of this office rests on the fact that it has a very strong and significant connection to the Roman Empire and to the great figure who made Rome so important. So, starting in the 10th century in particular, the Pope in Rome, And his name, which is a popular name, I mean his official name is the what? The Bishop of Rome, the leader of the church. Pope comes from Papa. He is our father, as our king is our father. And in fact, the magic of a pope arises from the fact that he conveys to us that he is a caring papa. That's why you can be over 70 and still keep the job. See, most people can't convey magic after that age because we are in a youth-oriented culture. This job, by its very name, do you understand? Its very name says the magic comes from being Papa, our father, the leader ruler. Somebody 22, I mean, it's going to be very hard to be Papa. One of the reasons for the continued success of this job, of this role, was that the Pope arranged in Western Europe for something that the Patriarch in Constantinople, the Pope in Constantinople, could not do. And that was he arranged for subordinates who had no other interest in their life but the church. Anybody who runs a corporation knows that if you have married executives, you have trouble. If they love their wife and their children, they have a second agenda. They may call up and not be available when you need them. So corporations suffer with married executives. But the Western Church liberated itself from that problem. It now required its clergy, after the 10th century, to be celibate. And therefore, the Pope was now accompanied by an extraordinary clergy. Not only a clergy of talent and education in many cases, but a clergy that was totally and absolutely devoted to its job 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It had no other powerful agenda to be concerned with. And that was a sign not of weakness, but of strength. The power of the Pope, of this new Roman emperor, increased because the only people who could read and write in Western Europe were his clergy. So if you were a king, your power was compromised because you didn't have any warriors who could read and write. If you wanted to manage your country, whom did you hire? You brought in bishops, priests, clergy to be the administrators of your government, and that was a source of great power. We in America, who frown on clergy taking government jobs, it's very hard for us to understand it, but that was very important. The Pope, his power increased because as the Roman emperor, he became the leader of a war against Islam. He called the war, and he was the great figure that mobilized the people of the war. They're called the Crusades, and the Crusades strongly enhanced the power of the Pope. His city, Rome? No. It became a city of pilgrimage. Most Christians in Western Europe didn't go to Jerusalem. Most Christians in Western Europe, if they were on a pilgrimage, they went to various shrines in their area, but the great pilgrimage by the 13th century was where? To Rome. And Rome was then beginning to be filled with the wonders that were not completed until the 16th and 17th century, but it was the place to go. And the power of the Pope was enhanced by the fact that Western Europe, the place where the Roman Catholic Church was, of which he was the head and the emperor, became enormously successful, so successful that by the 15th and 16th century it went out to conquer the world. See, you can't talk about the power of the Roman Catholic Church unless you talk about the power of Western Europe. How did Roman Catholicism get to South America or North America? Well, it followed the Spanish and the Portuguese. If there wasn't a powerful Spain and a powerful Portugal, the missionaries would never have gotten where they got. How did they get to Africa and parts of Asia? It was the power of Western Europe. Now, along the way, this powerful, powerful figure growing in power dealt with many challenges. One was the continuing presence of the Orthodox Church in the East, the Greek Orthodox. A second was the arrival in the West of a secular figure who wanted to be the head of Western Europe. He was the king of Germany. He called himself the Holy Roman Emperor, and he now was a rival to the Pope. One of the big challenges was, as time went on, and the Pope ran a very large organization. Very large organizations where there isn't a continuous change of personnel develop something called corruption. And the medieval church now recruited clergy who may have been talented, but they were less believing than the clergy who preceded them. One of the major challenges was that as the prosperity of Western Europe increased, there now arose nation states, in particular countries like France and England, that had very, very significant patriotism. So now there arises the problem. If you now feel strongly French or strongly English or strongly German, and the Pope is Italian, and you're sending all your money to Italians, then ultimately what happens is resentment and hostility, and already you can see that in the rebellions that broke out in Europe in the 15th century. But the major challenge, which defines the modern papacy. In fact, the papacy prior to 1525 was in many respects very different from the papacy that emerged afterwards. The event or series of events that defined the Pope is called the Reformation. Because of nationalism, because of corruption, most of Northern Europe arose in rebellion against the emperor, and they prevailed, and they organized a rival set of churches that we call the Protestant churches. We call that whole movement the Reformation. And the papacy began to rock. Luther imagined the Pope could be overthrown. And there was a time in the middle of the 16th century when people thought that would be possible. But that didn't happen. This last summer I went to visit a town I had never been to. It's north of Verona. It's in the Alps. It's called Trento. And for almost 30 years in this little town of Trento, which we call Trent, a church council was held. The bishops of the Roman Catholic Church who had remained loyal to the Pope now came together to discuss how they were going to fight this war. And out of the Council of Trent came what we call the Counter-Reformation. And the present Pope, in many respects, still remains the figure that came out of that Counter-Reformation. Since the Protestants said the Pope had no authority, or did not have all the authority that he claimed, he was simply the bishop of the Counter-Reformation, in response, said, he has all authority. Oh. The Counter-Reformation made the Pope an absolute monarch, an absolute king. In fact, the doctrine of infallibility, which was not confirmed until the 1870s, actually existed before because he was the absolute monarch. All authority flowed from him. No council of bishops could overrule him when he spoke as the voice of God. And that was the answer to the Protestant Reformation. The Counter-Reformation said, all ideas, all doctrines that in any way deviate from the official doctrines stated by the Pope shall not be allowed to be circulated. They shall be repressed. And in fact, two institutions were created to do that. One was the Index, which what? Censorship made a list of the books you couldn't read. And the Inquisitions, which what? Rooted out heretics and removed them because it was dangerous, and you have to understand why it was dangerous. If you listen to the false doctrine and follow the path of the false doctrine, you would never make it to heaven. You might go to hell. And therefore, preventing people from getting false information. By the way, we do it now. I'm in favor of taking away all cigarette advertising billboards because I think they lead people to hell. That by smoking, people will what? Destroy themselves and give themselves cancer, and therefore remove that advertising. We don't want that advertising. That advertising is what? It's dangerous. It's like advertising heroin. You're driving down Woodward Avenue, there's a big sign. You know, shoot up with heroin. Certainly, the Counter-Reformation decided that it had to spend more time educating Roman Catholics because they were now exposed to false doctrine. And so a new order emerged, the Jesuits, who helped to organize school after school after school after school. And the heart of that education was something that arose in the Counter-Reformation, a series of questions and answers, which you memorized. It's called the Catechism. That was to make sure you had the right answer. One of the symbols of the Counter-Reformation is indeed that the Pope, as the absolute monarch, as the Roman emperor, as the ruler of the church, should live in an appropriate splendor. Let me talk about authority. There's something that I call anti-snob authority. And some people can carry it off. What they do is they get the cheapest suit, rip it, open the collar, whatever, and they sort of walk in. And they stand there, and they're theoretically in charge. And the reason they can maintain their job is because they have such incredible personal charisma that the moment they open their mouth, do you understand? Sing the song, say the thing, doesn't make any difference. Their costume is what? Irrelevant. And a lot of people say, well, costumes don't mean anything, it's just what people are. And so that's not true. Because if you have a job, a role where it's very important to be authoritative, it may be the case that you will choose somebody who has personal charisma, but what? It may be the case that you won't. What if you get somebody who, when he sings, what? Nobody listens. Or when he speaks. So therefore, if the person is in that role, it's very important to ensure that people accept his authority. And the way to do that is that you have to have splendor. And so, in fact, the papacy was surrounded by splendor. The Counter-Reformation meant that now the Pope, to administer this church and to make sure that everything was done right, required a revamping of the organization, and out of it came what we call the curia, the court of the Pope, with all his what? His cabinet and his officials and the people who controlled the treasury, controlled the doctrines, whatever it be. It was now all organized. And, very important, was that the Pope from time to time must speak to the people to make sure that they understood what was right. And that's called, in fact, Pope John Paul II has issued 12 of them. They're called encyclicals. And they are proclamations, declarations from the Pope, not voted on by any democratically elected body, because he indeed is the voice of God, and indeed he issues these statements to what? Guide the people. In fact, his role is a role that certainly has a precedent. The precedent is the Roman emperor at the height of his power, living in ancient Rome. In fact, it is a continuation, and that, in a sense, is the role model. And the Counter-Reformation was fueled by the war against the Protestants. Now, one of the countries that was taken over by the Counter-Reformation is the country from which Karol Wojtyła comes. It's called Poland. So I have to tell you about Poland because he's not only the Pope, he's also the Polish, and very patriotically, the Polish Pope. He goes back to Poland frequently. Poles regard him as the King of Poland. He's the most famous Pole in the world. Half the Poles don't even know the name of their prime minister, but they certainly know who the Pope is. So let me talk about Poland. Poland chose Roman Catholicism as a way of avoiding an invasion by German Catholics. The Germans were Catholic. They wanted to move eastward. They wanted to take Poland, and the Poles threw themselves on the mercy of the Pope. And the Pope said, I'll protect you if what? I'll tell those Germans to stop. If you will become Catholic. They could have gone Greek Orthodox. So they joined the Roman Catholic world. Along the way, they developed an incredible agriculture, a wonderful agriculture. They became the granary of Eastern Europe. And along the way, they developed a nobility, a landlord class, and a warrior class. And they also developed a king, and the king and the warriors were always fighting each other. But the main problem of Poland was that it had enemies on two sides. To the west were the Germans, who, although they were Roman Catholic, wanted to move eastward. In time, because of the Reformation, the northern Germans who bordered Poland stopped being Catholic and became Protestant. And now the northern Germans, called the Prussians, had what? A good reason to invade Poland. After all, they were what? They were Protestants, and the Poles were Catholics. On the other side of Poland was a country called Russia. And the Russians weren't Roman Catholic. The Russians were Greek Orthodox. And in fact, the Greek Orthodox hated the Roman Catholics. The Roman Catholics hated the Greek Orthodox. So there they are between the... So the issues of religion became very important. Poland couldn't go Protestant because in the end, that would be an opening to Germany. And he couldn't go Orthodox because that would be an opening to Russia. Catholicism was now identified totally and completely with Polish patriotism. And then the Prussians and the Russians invaded. And they divided up Poland at the end of the 18th century. And they destroyed the nobility, and they took away the monarchy. And the only people left in Poland to serve as the leaders of the Polish people, just like the priests in Ireland. The English took away the Irish government, so the only people left for the people to turn to were their clergy. So the Polish Roman Catholic clergy became, by default, the leaders of the Polish people. There was nobody else. And for 2 centuries, Polish patriotism and Roman Catholicism could not be separated. So the King of Poland, in the absence of a Polish secular king, was the Pope. Just as the King of Ireland, in the absence of an Irish king or whatever, was the Pope. No 2 people in Europe were more Catholic than the Poles and the Irish, because they lost their government, and their government now became the Roman Catholic clergy, and the Roman Catholic clergy had been motivated and molded by the Counter-Reformation. The Pope was their leader, and they were the only force in their country to offer resistance. At the beginning of the 19th century, however, all over Western Europe, changes occurred that were to redefine the role, and that's what John Paul II is trying to do. He's trying to deal with the assault. So let me try to describe this assault, which changed the nature of the role first in Western Europe and later on in Poland. First was the coming to power of a middle class, we call them the bourgeoisie, who were the developers of a capitalistic economy. And the capitalistic economy disrupted and undermined the church. It undermined the church, as I have mentioned in other talks. It undermined the church because it focused the attention of the people not on the next world, but on happiness in this world and in this life. One of the assaults was the coming of the age of science, which followed capitalism, and a new way of looking at the issues of truth, the new technology, the power and reputation of science, and a new clergy. That's the thing. If you want to find out about the nature of the universe, whom do you contact? The Roman Catholic priest or the Protestant minister, or do you contact the chairman of the astronomy department at the university? You now have in our world, and that was of course a great blow, the new clergy. The new clergy don't go to seminaries. They get things called PhDs. And their employment possibilities now are not as good as Roman Catholic priests, because there's a shortage of priests and a plethora, an abundance of PhDs, but they are the new clergy. One of the assaults was the rise of the new nationalism. Following the French Revolution, what swept Europe was the idea that indeed we could find happiness here on earth, and the best way for us to find that happiness was to organize ourselves into powerful nation states. Well, you have only so much time during the day to sing songs, sing anthems, pledge allegiance to flags. Do you understand? So, do you sing French patriotic songs, pay allegiance to the French state, glorify the French flag, or do you spend your time in religious activity? Because patriotism is a rival to religious activity. For some people, patriotism is the new religion. Just as science provided an alternative, so did patriotism. And then the worst of all, the French Revolution brought an idea with it that was also to be found to some degree in the American Revolution, and that was that the state no longer required the talents or the power offered by the clergy. Science and secular education would be sufficient. So now we have something called the separation of religion and government. So you have to understand what that means. What that means is, up until that time, if you wanted to build a large cathedral, you didn't have to have a building fund. You went to the king. The king was the government. You went to Duke so-and-so, Count so-and-so. You went to the government. The government built the building. If you wanted to pay the clergy, you didn't run around from door to door trying to collect money for the priest. You went to the government. Separation of religion and government means that the Roman Catholic Church, like every other religion, is on its own. But the Roman Catholic Church was accustomed for 1,600 years to be an established church. But it's more than money. What about the schools? Prior to the French Revolution, if you wanted an education, you went to the church. All the schools were run by the church. Now the Revolution created patriotic schools. They're called state schools. They take state money and put them into the schools, and they'll say, we'll pay for those schools, but you're not going to get a penny for parochial schools. Wow. And then the worst. It's the worst. It's what happened to the House of Windsor, and I mentioned it last week. So it's called democracy. See, before democracy, people were accustomed to revering their elders and to revering their parents. So if you said, Papa said, oh, Papa said. Now in the age of democracy, what we have is this new free, egalitarian society in which our rulers are elected. So now the ruler has to come to you and say, I'm Bill. And I would love your vote. And then you say, well, why should I vote for you? The power situation is reversed. So it's no longer Papa says, but what do you need? How can I serve you? What can I do? Now, nothing in the history of the Roman Catholic Church prepared itself for democracy. Got it? It came as a wave, as a result of the economic change, and all of a sudden, these old authoritarian governments are overthrown, and there is the Roman emperor. The Roman emperor did not rule by marketing. He ruled by intimidation. We all go through that crisis because if you're ever a teacher and you realize the changes, or a parent, before you went just growled. And now, please, it's going to be good for you. All right, the whole change. So the church now had to cope, and the coping strategies are still part of the dispute that defines the role of this pope. One, from the very beginning, the church said, we can't deal with this democracy. So what we're going to do is we're going to ally ourselves with the two classes of people that don't like it. The people who liked it were the bourgeoisie. The people who didn't like it were the army, the military, and the peasants who hadn't been urbanized, who didn't understand it. One of the ways we're going to cope is we're going to send a lot of people out and get... No, by the way, the spurt in missionary activities of the 19th century, as Western Europe declined in faith, the church shipped out missionaries all over the world. Maybe we'll be able to capture other people, convert other people who indeed will join the organization. And then the Pope, as the spokesman of the church, regularly issued encyclicals. So now let me tell you what the church hated in the 19th and early 20th century. They hated democracy. It was the predecessor to chaos. They hated modernism. Modernism are any ideas that came from science, like Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. Those were modern doctrines. It hated liberalism. Liberalism are those people running around saying, I am the master of my life. I am entitled to be free. I'm entitled to choose what I will do with my life. They didn't like capitalism. Most of the encyclicals that dealt with social and economic affairs denounced capitalism because capitalism, they said, was not turning power over to the people of honor, that would be the army. Capitalism was turning power over to the people of greed. That was the businessmen and the bankers. And they hated socialism because socialism wasn't necessarily a bad idea for them. What they didn't like about socialism is that socialism had picked up a militant atheism, which it wasn't necessary. I mean, you can be a what? A devout socialist. You can be a religious socialist. But that isn't how socialism evolved. Socialism, or the leaders of socialism in Europe, chose the church as an enemy and therefore developed this militant atheism. And now what? Hate socialism. The symbol of it all was a council that was held in the early 1870s called Vatican Council I. And at that meeting, the ideas of the Counter-Reformation were upheld. The Pope is infallible. He is the absolute ruler of the church. And beware of all these dangers. And Vatican Council I had a theme, which I want you to remember because it's the big issue. Vatican Council I basically said, millions and millions of people don't like what's going on now. They don't like this world of competition and greed and mobility and families breaking down. They want to go back to what was. And therefore, what the church has to be is a symbol of what was. And a good symbol of what was, because what was is better than what is. So, we're not going to apologize. We're going to stand up and tell you that the faith of our fathers was what? Terrific. So let me give you some of the names of the popes, because John Paul II, most people don't remember all the other popes. I'm going to give you a series of popes. I'm going to start with the pope from the middle of the 19th century. His name was Pius IX. Pius IX, when he came to the throne, and he was a rather dour person. When he came to the throne, not only had the Vatican, he owned all of Rome and all the territory around Rome. And then it was taken from him